Welcome back to American Agenda. I'm Bob Sellers here with Heather Childers. Legal scholar Dr. John Eastman, a senior fellow, Claremont Institute, believes that state legislatures in states where voter fraud allegations are rampant can and should select new presidential electors. The former dean of Chapman University School of Law, Dr. Eastman himself, joins us now to explain why he feels that way. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. You're saying essentially where fraud is well established, and that seems to have been one of the legal obstacles that they've had so far with some of the cases, the Trump campaign. So is that a prerequisite for you, or do you think there's enough evidence out there that legislatures should make those choices anyway?
Well, it's actually not the fraud allegations, but it's the violations of state statutes that I think is the prerequisite.
Okay.
The federal Constitution clearly gives the legislatures of the state the plenary power to determine the manner for choosing electors. And they do that, of course, by passing statutes. And when those statutes are not followed, such as statutes limiting who's eligible for absentee ballots, or the signature verification and other voter ID requirements invalidating those ballots, those statutes violations mean that the election was not conducted in the manner that the legislature set out. And in that context, both the Article 2 of the federal Constitution and also Section 2 of Title 3 of the United States Code authorized the state legislatures to reclaim their plenary power to determine the manner for choosing electors.
So just to get to the bottom line, what I'm hearing you say, that it is constitutional under that example where they have violated the state statutes. It is constitutional for legislators to circumvent electors?
Well, not circumventing electors. We have an election that was invalid. They had the full authority to determine how that election was to be conducted. And they do that by statutes. And when those statutes are ignored by elected officials of the states, we have an invalid election. By the way, this is exactly what the Florida legislature was prepared to do in 2000 before the Supreme Court made it unnecessary. They had passed a statutory scheme that their state Supreme Court was ordering to be violated. And so they passed out of committee a resolution approving their own slate of electors. And those committee resolutions were already set for floor votes by the Florida legislature when the Supreme Court decided the case in Bush versus Gore.
Yeah. So, Dr. Eastman, if you're saying this should happen if the state statutes are not followed, doesn't that imply that some sort of body, judicial, I should suggest, would have to determine that those statutes had not been followed? Have we reached that point?
No, this is one of those rare cases where the ultimate authority is assigned to somebody other than the judiciary. The Supreme Court in a case, 1892 case called McPherson versus Blecker, said even if a state constitution had said that they have to choose electors by a popular vote, the state legislature still had power to ignore that and choose the electors themselves. Because the plenary power is vested in the legislature of the state to determine the manner for choosing electors. And if they deem that their state statutory scheme was violated, I believe that's sufficient.
All right. Well, Dr. Eastman, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And to give us a little different perspective on this matter, joining us now to discuss potential recounts and to share his opinion on selecting new presidential electors is distinguished university professor at Electoral College, Thane Rosenbaum. Thank you for joining us. You heard what Mr. Eastman just had to say there. What's your take?
Well, I don't disagree with Professor Eastman. From the very beginning, we have thought Justice Alito and Justice Kavanaugh had said over the last several months that they were concerned that the general rule under the Constitution that state election officials are not allowed to unilaterally change election laws, it must be done by the state legislature, presented a constitutional argument, which is essentially what Professor Eastman has said. There's also an argument, an equal protection argument, if the Supreme Court ever took the case, which is to say there seems to be two different standards of voting. You got treated very differently if you showed up in person with your ID versus if you mailed it in, right? Because you have very different standards of verification of who you were. You could send in your cousin's ballot, but you really couldn't show up and pretend you were your cousin if you showed up in line on election day. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, hasn't heard this. The one thing I would say about what the professor just said is that it's never been tested before. We've never done it. This is a 19th century statute called the Electoral Count Act. It may also be true that in some states, it's not even the legislature that holds the plenary power, even in spite of what the statute said. It's the governor who gets to decide the slate of electors. Look, the president's campaign team, legal team, has always looked, their biggest Hail Mary was for the Supreme Court, and they're just not getting there. So this is another route that the professor has pointed out. It's a legitimate route, but it's been legally untested in the history of this country.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
I was going to ask, I studied government in college and some constitutional law, but not the expert you are, which is why we're asking you, not me. But I was curious. It seems though the Electoral College was designed to actually give another layer, so you don't have the passions of the majority making a bad decision on a vote. So the Electoral College would say, yeah, well, that was crazy. We're going to make this decision. But I don't recall the Founding Fathers and the Federalist Papers or the rest just saying, well, and then forget about the Electoral College. Now we're just going to let state legislatures make that decision. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know.
Well, remember, the first few elections, we didn't have popular votes. It was done by members of Congress. So that makes it very different. The way it got interpreted, Bob, and you're quite right, it didn't start out that way. The way it got interpreted is that the Electoral College, the delegates for each state, would vote the will of the people, the popular will of the people. And in order to do what this Professor Eastman just said, under the statute, is if the state legislature argues that our state election was a failure. Again, they never told us what failure means. But if it's, quote, a failure, we can substitute our own slate of electors. Right, and that was sort of the concession that was operating here, and it was a way to put a check on the possibility that if, in fact, the will of the people can't be determined. And I suspect what the Trump legal team would say is, with all these voter verification problems, the relaxing of standards, the altering of ballots, the overlooking of defects, the sealing of envelope problems, the discrepancies in the rejection rates, this constitutes failure. And that therefore, because of the failure, the legislature's on its own to do what this professor just suggested.
I feel like we need Fred Friendly to head up a whole discussion of this, Professor. It's really fascinating, and I appreciate you talking to us about it, educating us, and hopefully this hasn't been too boring for folks, because this is actually something happening in real time that is pressuring some of those constitutional issues right now, and I find that fascinating. So, Professor Rosenbaum, thank you, sir.
Thank you both.
All right, keep it here on NewsMax. Coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern, Trish Regan is going to join Chris Salcedo to discuss the impact of new shutdowns in liberal states on the local and national level. That's tonight on the Chris Salcedo Show. Don't want to miss that. That'll be very interesting. And also, hope it'll be very interesting coming up next, also on American Agenda.